All right, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of HR Heretics. We have my good friend here today, DK Donald Knight. A lot of you might know him. He has been in the industry for years and years. Amazing background, including HR leadership roles at Equifax and Greenhouse, Lattice, most recently joined Warner Brothers Discovery as their SVP of People and Culture, which I'm excited to get into. Also, awesome venture partner advisor, CrossFitter. We'll go into that later. We were talking about that before the show started. But let's start in, DK, with you actually did not want to be in HR when you started. Is that correct?
No, not at all.
That was an explicit decision. I'm not doing that.
No, I just felt like, I feel like there are certain professions in life that like attract young people and gets us super excited. And we're like, oh my goodness, I want to be there. Like, no, I didn't want to join HR. I felt like the profession is often discounted. And for me, I felt like, the way you typically see people talk about HR, it's like they support the business or they're like a back office. And I'm like, no, like if you know your business, then you know that HR is actually the business. Number one expense line item, ask any CFO, number one expense line item for most companies until AI continues to take over is people. And so once I started to learn the business, I started to understand, oh no, like we can really make some meaningful impact if you understand that part of the business. And so for my teams, it's a responsibility to really dive deep into the numbers. And the biggest number, of course, is headcount. And so trying to understand how we motivate people, I think, is what ultimately compelled me. And there was a CHRO, Kay Kennedy, who convinced me that the profession was going to change. And my then girlfriend convinced me not to go straight to law school, to go give HR a shot. That agency ended up paying for 25% of my MBA. So I'm very thankful to Kay Kennedy and to that amazing girlfriend. I married her and gave her 2 kids. So
I think she gave you 2 kids, actually, is how that worked.
Well, I mean, yeah. Well, that's Nolan, you got a good point.
It's kind of a partnership, isn't it? I mean,
I thought so.
Not in my house.
DK, do you think that the profession has changed? Do you think that that's correct? Has that happened?
Yeah, I think we've gone, I'm going to date myself. I got to see the leaders that came up through what was then compliance and watch compliance transform into personnel. And then I got to see up close personnel create all these labor issues. And that's where labor unions came from. And then I saw that kind of evolve into the importance of treating humans as resources and the value that they can unlock. And I think we're constantly on this evolution. I think right now you see a lot of people focusing on, being more people-centric. Do I think everyone in our profession has evolved with the times? No. And I think that's in any profession, though. I think you have folks that are early adopters and crossing that chasm and trying to understand, in the words of the great Wayne Gretzky, where the puck's going to be. And I think there's a few leaders out there that I hold in high regard that have done so and are really pushing the envelope. And then I think there's others that either due to their industry or due to the leaders that they surround themselves by and the environments they're in, they're not as keen to be more thoughtful and more modern. But I think the profession for the most part continues to evolve. And now we're in an evolution that I don't think any of us would have predicted, which I think is pretty amazing. I think we're in the middle of what I consider the eye of the storm, if you will.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I will say, though, that there feels like the pendulum really swung on this last run up to being more employee friendly. And it does feel like the pendulum is starting to swing back a little bit. I think most of that is healthy. A couple of the things that Kelli and I have talked about, Chamath Palihapitiya, who's on the All In podcast, has started a new company, and he's now saying like no HR allowed in the company. Kelli and I have covered a ton on the show how many companies are getting rid of their DEIB teams. Most recently, I think over the weekend, Boeing just did theirs. So what's your take on some of this pushback? Is it healthy? Is it just like a little bit of a blip in the radar, or is there something bigger going on here?
Yeah, so not a blip on the radar. The founders of the company I was with prior to this phenomenal company, Greenhouse Software, they wrote a book called, Talent Making. And basically one of the hot takes inside of the book says that the war for talent is over. Talent won. I agree with them. The problem is talent squandered the win. They squandered it. So you had social injustice start to happen. Everybody was at home during the pandemic. It forced people in every race and every ethnicity to freeze, stand still, pay attention. And what did we see happen? Like, I feel like we squandered it. We weren't successful. And I say we because I'm a part of the industry, part of the profession. I think we squandered the win. We squandered the opportunity that we had all of the business leaders' attention. Now what? Right? It could have been a ripe opportunity to change earnings calls and to link the performance of people to the performance of the company financially and literally be able to shift the way that we talk about business performance moving forward. We didn't do that. What we did was we over-indexed on the things that felt good, right? So the importance of belonging and diversity and inclusion, and those things are still very much important. The problem though is if they're not linked to business outcomes, if they're not based on where you're taking the company from a vision casting perspective, if people don't see diversity and inclusion as a strategic imperative to growth and higher profitability, win squandered. And so, yeah, that season, you're right. That pendulum swung, that war was over. Now we're in a new war, and the employer has more opportunities. And what they're doing is you see this ever so often. It is swung so opposite that people are saying, you got to come back into the office. We're not going to have HR teams. The HR professionals have no clue what they're doing is what's being said. You don't need DEIB teams. And I'm like, whoa, pause, flag on the play. You still need all those things. And so I do think that there's a group of leaders that are out there in the profession that I try to spend a lot of time with, that we're trying to figure out, okay, there are certain companies that if we can move the needle there, I think you'll find the rest of the industry really follow that lead, almost like a Lewis and Clark expedition. But yeah, we squandered the win.
I have I'd love your I don't know if there's an answer to this, but I would think that it's rational. Like a reasonable person would understand that DIB, et cetera, these things are important, and we have to connect them to the business and the outputs of that. Why is everyone just quitting then? Like, why, like, if that's reasonable and we think it's good, is it just laziness? Like, why is everyone just taking the opportunity? Not everyone, but a lot of folks taking the opportunity just to cut it versus continue to cross the line on what actually matters is connecting it, because it does matter. I don't get that.
I have an idea, Donald, I'd love your opinion on. I think it's really easy to virtue signal, and I think it's really hard to actually drive real change.
I think that's true. I think there's some inputs that I agree with Nolan, but I think that there's some inputs that happen. The first thing is the profession allowed business performance to be juxtaposed in direct contradiction of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So if you think about this from a Swiss cheese model, that's the first hole we got through. It's like we said, oh, you got to do one or the other. I don't believe you have to do one or the other. You got to do both. Right? So you get through that. And then it's like, okay, there were still some leaders that were around that said, okay, I still see the value. What are you unlocking? What potential are you unlocking? The industry didn't have a consistent vernacular. Think about this, like a CFO. Every CFO, regardless of what company they're on, they know what EBITDA is. That is consistent language. We didn't have consistent language.
Yeah, true.
And so you got some people out here talking about ERGs. You got people over here talking about affinity groups. They're over here fight.
Equity is the perfect description of like, there is, I have never heard consistent language in one conversation to another.
Yeah. And so what the profession should have did, it was like, agree on what are the set terms. Let's define these terms first, and then figure out how you link it back to the business outcomes, which in my opinion, is not that hard. Diversity of thought drives creativity. We already know that. Creativity should drive innovation. Innovation should drive revenue, and then revenue drives profits. It's not that hard, but if it's only 1 out of 1,000,000 or 2 out of 600,000 talking about it, and there's not a set core of definitions, I think that's where we mess up. I think the third thing that we did that CEOs traditionally got, upset with, which, oh, by the way, CEO, the most non-diverse role on the planet. If you don't believe me, ask Katie. I think one of the things that we had to do is we had to be able to figure out how do we solve their pain points and still do so without sacrificing the proverbial progress that was made. And most folks in the profession threw up their hands and were like, no, I'm done. The leader saying you got to come back to work. Why are you doing that? That's anti-flexibility. And I'm like, I don't think so. You know, there's some leaders, they've only been successful getting to that level of leadership, being inside of or thriving in environments where you saw in-person collaboration. And so we can't just go say, no, to hell with in-person collaboration. No, that's anti-flexibility. I'm like, I don't know. So I think that's where the pendulum swung.
Yeah. What's your take on, I think another point I hear from folks that are like rejecting this trend right now is that we're trying to boil everything down to immutable traits like race and gender. And I can see both sides here because this is where I think the measurement thing is really hard. Like, it's easiest to measure race and gender. We know what that is and we can measure that. But then there's like socioeconomic diversity. There's diversity of thought. There's diversity of geography. There's all sorts of like different angles of diversity that I don't think we do a good job accounting for. What's your take on that?
First of all, anytime you're talking about the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion, you have to think about where you're physically located on the planet because they take very different meanings depending on where you are, right? If you're talking to people in the Caribbean, they're talking about being from the African diaspora and how do they go get residency back in the countries in which they were originated, right? You go over to the EU, these folks are so used to being able to freely flow from France to Ireland to Greece that they're trying to figure out, okay, Europe is becoming more and more of a melting pot. What does that even look like for us moving forward? Right? Despite the fact that if you were born in Bermuda, you had residency in England. So they're talking about DEI through a different lens. You go to India, which outside of Africa has the youngest population, 1.4 billion people. And DEI for them is more homogenous than anything. So they have a very different DEI conversation. So this idea that we're just going to place like one big blanket on everybody and say, this is it. No, the rules of the road are different. Very similar to America. You drive on one side of the road here, you go over to Europe, it looks very different. Our interstates still have speed limits. The Autobahn doesn't. And so you got to figure out what flavor of DEI you're going to have. And so to your point, I think it's nuanced. And so the conversations have to become nuanced.
Yes. And that's where I personally struggle. And have gotten into a few arguments on what you said, Nolan, which was just like finance, just like sales, we need a consistent measure. We need the EBITDA for HR. We need the did you make quota or not for HR? Like the reality is it's just more complex. Like it's just fucking more complex than EBITDA. Like they're people. And their behaviors. And I've gotten a little fired up just because, like, believe me, I love metrics. I love tying to the business. I also think it's always possible. I also think that some things just don't need to be obsessively measured because they are complex. And like, just because you can't measure them, it doesn't mean it's not impacting your business in very intense ways. And I feel like we've gone away from that a little bit and obsessed over this measure it, and it's just not the reality. Hey everyone, we'll be right back in a moment after a word from our sponsors. Real talk, most talent leaders haven't yet cracked how to leverage AI for meaningful impact on their hiring processes and business goals. But the leaders who are effectively using AI to transform their recruiting team's efficiency and quality use Metaview. Metaview is the AI assistant for the interview process. Their AI records and transcribes hiring conversations, like intakes, interviews, and debriefs, then provides perfectly summarized notes of everything that was discussed. That means your people can focus on creating human connections with candidates during calls and save time on the busy work of cleaning up notes after every interview. But it's so much more than just a time saver, because perfect notes means perfect data. For every candidate in every pipeline, hiring teams can make confident, informed decisions, and talent leaders can finally take control of the interview process. Join forward-thinking talent leaders at high-performing organizations like Brex, HelloFresh, and Quora, and check out Metaview. Head over to metaview.ai/heretics to talk to one of Metaview's product experts or get started for free. You'll be up running and AI enabled in minutes.
Well, to build off you, Kelly, I also think it's okay for companies to have different stances and positions on this topic. What's not okay is that they don't tell you about it, or they virtue signal something else, which actually isn't part of the reality of working at that company. And that's, I think, what ended up happening. If I look back and I really, truly try and analyze what happened here, basically you just had to copy what big tech was doing. And if you didn't copy what big tech was doing, candidates were like, well, you're not offering me this thing, or there's not an ERG here or whatever. And companies felt like they had to do those things to compete, to go all the way back, Donald, to what you were saying for the war for talent. And that's how they were trying to compete. And I think what people are learning right now is that it's actually better to be differentiated. It's better to take a stance on something, especially if the majority doesn't agree with you, because then ultimately the people who you really want working at that company will work at that company. And I think that's the moment that we're in right now. I think the moment we're in right now is like the defining moment of, let's define ourselves as a company, and let's actually like tell people who we are and what we stand for. And it's okay to be different from big tech and the rest of Silicon Valley.
Yeah, a part of me wants to say that, I agree with most of what you just said, Nolan, in the sense that, big tech typically does have an outsized voice, mainly because of their profitability.
Exactly. Monopoly businesses.
However, if you go look at their boards, right, they're pretty diverse, especially from a diversity of thought perspective. This is why I said, earlier when I said if you go talk to CEOs, I had the opportunity to spend some time with Katie Ledecky recently. And she talked about the various CEOs that come to her and talk about like being competitive. And she's like, listen, the 1500 freestyle has been around for men long before it was around as an official race for women. But like, for the most part, the training is the same. And so what you got to figure out is, what race are you in, number one, as a company? And then go train appropriately. I think it's lazy. If Kelly were to go start a business and I'm going to go start a business and I think I'm just going to follow her culture, that's laziness. Patagonia is a thriving business. NVIDIA is a thriving business. Chick-fil-A is a thriving business. Very different culturally. And so to your point, I don't want to just blame big tech, because I think that there were leaders at these organizations that they should have done their homework. They should have figured out, what kind of talent philosophy do we want to have here? What kind of culture do we want to have here? And then make the necessary investments to be able to define that culture and be able to live by it, right? And I don't think that means you have to be less exclusive, less inclusive, because Coke Industries is pretty diverse. Elon Musk's board for Tesla is pretty diverse, right? So I think that's where I don't want to just point fingers. It's like, how do we make real meaningful progress move forward? And I think that's going to be similar to what Kelly was saying. It's, if you don't have the right metrics to measure, okay, that's fine. I'm measuring a business with 500 individuals very differently than I'm going to go measure Walmart with 1.2 million associates, right? So
yeah, I think the best companies and the best leaders, forget about tech, like anything, the best leaders are going to realize that there's usually more than one right answer. Things are both things. My therapist used to say both things can be true. Like, that's a reasonable thing. It's confusing why so many people have such a hard time living it. Anyway, I digress.
Well said, Donald. Okay, I want to transition to talking about your paternity leave. So I was doing research before the show, and I came across a post, which was actually a video of you describing your paternity leave plan. And just to give the audience what I saw, because I thought it was awesome, you basically came out and said, hey, I'm going to take this time with my family. I think it's really important to do that. We kind of hear the same thing as like whatever, I got to model it for other people. But the thing that you did that I haven't seen anyone else do is you were incredibly explicit about passing the baton to 3 of your direct reports and how much trust you had in them. And what I thought you nailed is that you're like giving these 3 people an opportunity to step up and take on more. Like, if I reflect back on my life, where I think I've been most privileged and lucky is that people bet on me. They bet on me to take a next step when I hadn't done it before. And I just love that you like explicitly called it out. I'm curious about like the process of that. Like, how did you select these three people? How did you get that buy-in on your executive team? Like, how did you come up with this thing? And how did you get the confidence to like be so public with it?
Yeah. First of all, I think, it's rooted in guilt. If I'm honest with you, Nolan, I have two amazing children now. At the time I wrote that post, only one of them was outside of the womb. So my son Dalen, he was 13 years old. He'll be 14 in December. And the guilt really stems from when we had him in 2010, I didn't take any time off. Now, I'm not going to play the compare game, or especially with, age, race, or gender, but like, I feel like Kelli and I are close in age, and she can speak to this. Men weren't taking time off. And if we did, it was almost as a checkbox to satisfy whatever family member was in your ear about not taking any time. It was taboo. And the guilt that I have is I feel like I sent the wrong message to the people on my team. I was lucky enough to be in a position of leadership very early on. And to this day, I still feel like I sent the wrong message to that team. And I don't know how many people either saw me as part of my direct leadership or even around the company that has then followed in those footsteps. And I feel like that was a misstep. So it was guilt. And I promised myself that if we were ever blessed to have another child, I would do it very differently. And so very differently to me was, okay, aspirationally, how could I make more positive imprints on people in that organization and around me in the business ecosystem than I might have done with the guilt that I carried from 2010. And so to me, it was like, okay, let's use this as an opportunity to accelerate the growth of other people, even though I'm prioritizing the well-being of my family. Let's go look at like their development plans. And all three of those individuals had aspirations of being a chief people officer one day in their career. And there's not a doubt in my mind that if they stay on the road and the trajectory that they're on, all three of them are more than capable of achieving that. But like, let's look at their development. Let's go ahead and map that out. Let's do the buy-in inside of the organization to let them know, why am I giving certain duties to one and not to another? And then make sure that we give them a guide, who was then my chief legal officer, as someone that they could have as a soundboard as they navigated these new changing responsibilities that they did not have before. And I wanted to be public with it because of the guilt, but also to make sure that the community, the industry rallied around them. And so that's really what drove that. Did I know it was going to go viral? No, I didn't know it was going to go viral. And I didn't know so many people would then, like, since then, some folks have followed in that footsteps. I think the cool thing, though, is that I did not know is that it would send an alert to all the executive recruiters that I actually had time to interview.
To ping those people.
Yeah. So, I started taking calls, and then, I mean, the rest is history, man. Like, some calls you just got to take. And so I think their growth was the priority, rooted in my guilt, but then my own growth accelerated, getting back to, a Fortune 100 company, being able to shape people and culture on a massive scale. So,
yeah. And I think like over the past, 4 or 5 years, et cetera, I've seen a lot more fight. And I was one of them, fighting to give, equal or almost equal leave benefits for the other parent that didn't, carry the child. Sometimes it's a dad, sometimes it's not, you know what I mean? So that's been a big deal. And we are close in age. I've said my age before on this show. So you can, through deductive reasoning, get Donald's age if you'd like. But like my boys are going to be 14 in February. So like a month behind you. And my guilt, because I was the working parent at that time. And I did stay home for almost 4 months. But after that, it was like, gone. Like 6:30 a.m. train to San Francisco till 7 p.m. back. I mean, and so I still carry a lot of guilt being, gone for a long time, and which is why I'm taking, time now. But I get that guilt. And one thing I've also seen companies step up, which is great, because I had this anxiety when I decided to take 4 months off, which seemed like a long fucking time if you're the head of people, for a startup. is the anxiety of being able to return safely and confidently back into the company, because you can feel like you've been in orbit and gone, like Fly the Navigator, old 80s movie, like gone for like 8 years and everything's changed. And so I think I just want to accent the importance of bringing people back safely with open arms back into a company where they might feel like things have moved on without them.
Yeah. So Donald, I want to quickly talk about this like recruiting thing that happened. So, you put out this post, you have your team take over for you. Let's actually start there. How did that go? Like I, similar to you, when my son was born, I think I took 10 days. And then, what I told everyone is like, oh, I'm going to take it like later on. And I probably took like a week, which was like not even like what my vacation was, not to mention parental leave. But I think for me, one of the big fears was the business is going to struggle without me there. And so what did you experience, during your pat leave, and how did the team do, and how did it map to your expectations?
I think the first thing I would say is they exceeded my expectations because I had no blueprint to go off of, right? No leader in the history of my career had ever prioritized parental leave as a means of allowing people to gain additional exposure and experience. Now, in my career, I have gained experience and exposure, but it has never been through parental leave as the catalyst. So I didn't have any expectations, so they far exceeded it. I will say that leading up to, I think the preparation is the biggest part. So like I did weekly meetings with these individuals, with 2 out of the 3 individuals each week. The third individual was a new hire who I still speak to regularly, especially since that company is still in the process of backfilling my role. And so that person to be named here in the next, few weeks and months, or a few weeks, but starting the next few months. And so very intentional in making sure that during that time still had monthly downloads once a month, even on parental leave, to make sure any of the, hairy, sticky things that may get in the way, that I could help provide some level of guidance. I think on the recruitment side, that's what didn't go, right? There were 2 folks, that one of which was one of the individuals that took on some of those responsibilities, that actually joked and said, "Hey, what if you never come back?" And I'm like, "What do you mean?" Like, Kelli will tell you, I was very much ingrained in the internal and external portions of the culture. And it wasn't something I actually fathomed in a meaningful way until I started receiving the calls around, "Hey, how's the baby doing? Baby's doing well. Great. We got these opportunities for you." And I vetted about 7 opportunities and got to offer letter on 3. And I remember dreading the day that I was going to have to tell the CEO. And, I talked to my wife, and my wife was just like, "Listen, the same way you've prioritized your growth, their growth, you got to prioritize your own." I will say that CEO is still there, and I think he's an amazing human being. And he has never made me feel less than for prioritizing myself. And so I think that's the sign of a solid person and a solid human being. And I think all of us, don't we want that? Like, sometimes spreading your wings means you have to leave the very cocoon that you're in. And in that case, that may mean the proverbial greenhouse. But I think it's good. Like the send off video that he gave me and talked about like the experiences that we shared together will always leave a positive mark for me. Doesn't mean it was a perfect journey or that we had the perfect transition, but it does mean that I feel like I'm a better leader because of that experience. And my hope is that I left some humans in better places from a growth and development than when I found them.
What an awesome story. And Kelli and I have talked about this a couple of times on the show. It turns out like if you can leave well, and I think specifically for your former boss, the CEO, if they can receive that and then number one, be okay with it and see that you are trying to grow and, you've made a decision and respecting your decision. I just find that in today's world, unfortunately, it seems to be very rare. And, most managers suck, and managers are fucking brutal when you say like, "Hey, I've decided to do something else." This is an area that I've been growing in my career. I have a lot of regrets on how I left companies earlier in my career. And I think if you can leave well, it leaves such a lasting impression for the relationship and enables that relationship to grow in ways that were not possible with you as an employee in the building.
Yeah. And if you're the boss of that person, Like that is a litmus test, assuming they're handling that well. How you're handling that is just like that would be actually like a background check question I would ask someone. Hey, have you ever witnessed, folks leaving this person and how they handled that?
What a great idea, Kelli.
It's a great idea.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
I never even asked that, but I want to, hey, have you ever seen, people quit on this person? What was that like? I think that is a pivotal moment of character and the sign of a good leader.
That can only be, by the way, revealed. Like stated doesn't matter. Like how somebody says they're going to do it doesn't matter until it actually happens, because it's one of those things that until you actually live through the experience, your character will not be revealed until that moment.
Well, if you start getting, background check questions on that, you know where it came from.
I'll add this as well, though. I think the sign of a great leader is even if you're torn up that an amazing talent is leaving, you should not show it to that person. I believe if someone is prioritizing their growth and their development, even if you're personally torn up, they don't need any additional indicator on how they're leaving you or how hurt you may feel. And I think the problem, Nolan, to your question, and I think Kelli has probably experienced this in her career as well. I think the reason why leaders treat people so wrong when they leave is because they feel like, oh, they made the decision and I didn't get to be a part of it. But it's not your decision to make all the time.
No. Yeah. Or insecurity, right? And it's like these parents that put unnecessary guilt on their children. Like that is not the job. And it's incredible what can come back to you. I mean, this talent boomerangs back. You'll work with them again. Like people want to work with you when you're like that. Or like I'll get calls, hey, can you come coach me or can you come consult? Because we worked together 10 years ago. It's like these things really do matter.
You're describing the long game though. And I think this is the thing, is like it takes a level of maturity and self-confidence to look past your short-term problems and understand that there is a long game at play with these relationships. And not only just the relationship of the person, you and the person that's leaving, but the rest of the company that's watching what's going on. And I really think CEOs underestimate how big of an impact it has watching it done well on the rest of the company and the level of followership that you can gain if you do it really, really well.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Totally. DK, I would love to transition to founders, right? We've kind of been through the ringer on this, and there's probably, a million stories, but just to reflect on kind of, what's your view on working with founders? We have all this stuff out there now, founder mode and this, and everything's kind of flying around, but like what matters most when working with these interesting specimens? Like what are the pivotal moments and things that you recall on like working with these people?
Yeah, I think I got highs, lows, and takeaways, right? I'll start with the highs. I think, first of all, working with founders, I didn't realize this walking into it, but I heard the CEO of Box say this, and his CPO, Jess Swank, is a really, really good friend of mine. His name escapes me, but he's like, there we go, Aaron Levin. Thank you, Nolan. He said something. He said, I hope Jess is our last CPO. He's had 5. He says, I hope this is my last CPO. He said, but if she's not, I will still be here. And basically what he was conveying, which I wish someone would have told me on the front end, is that what is normally viewed as like a position or a growth opportunity or development or the next rung in the ladder or whatever you want to frame it as, it's not that for the founder. For the founder, this is like everything. They remember not being able to pay payroll. They've put it all on the line. They've taken out all types of unique financing to get the company where it is. And they can remember all of the meaningful moments along the way, especially the highs and the lows. And so I think the reason I bring that up is one of the highs for me is being able to see a leader that passionate about their company. I haven't seen that. Most leaders have a change of control or they got a golden parachute that as a CEO or as an executive. And so I think that was a high. That level of passion, I think, was a high. I think the second high is we grew a ton. 57% 2 years. It's what if we were a sport, we definitely put up some banners, some championship banners. But the growth was messy. It wasn't always like linear. It was definitely difficult. I mean, you think about the high of the highs in 2022 and then doing multiple reductions in force. That's tough. When you think about looking at organizational design and realizing that the result of this consultation is probably going to mean that some people are made redundant. You're probably going to consolidate certain skill sets. Like that's tough. So, but the highs of that is like being able to understand what that feels like. It's such a smaller company because the emotional feel on it is a lot harder because you really know everybody. Like you go work for a company that's less than 1,000, you typically know those folks. I think the lows for me was seeing some of the amazing humans we accomplished the banners with leave. Like, I saw multiple CFOs, my chief revenue officer left, my head of international left, my CTO left to make his own company. And like, these are people that, you're forged through proverbial battle with, right? I think the takeaways, right? Here's the takeaway from that low. Number one, all of those relationships are still intact. I talk to those humans at least some once every week, the others at least once a month. These folks sent gifts for my daughter when she was born in March. I've helped advise some of them on some of their entrepreneurial pursuits. So that's some of the takeaways. One of the other takeaways though, and I don't think we talk about this enough, is again, going back to the sports theme, while we put championships up, you know how many teams stay exactly the same year over year in a sports season? Exactly 0. And so like from that perspective, I wish I would have known that on the front end. It's like preparing for, some of my favorite players on the team are going to leave. Some of my favorite people in the front office are going to leave. And that's okay. That's okay. So I think those are some of the highs and the lows and some of the takeaways. But yeah, I mean, look, I'm still rooting for their success. Number one, I have a financial reason to, but number two, I still have a lot of humans there that I just genuinely care about. And so, yeah, I think that's some of the greatest takeaways is knowing that you've established what you thought were meaningful relationships, even if you end up changing jerseys. So
you just nailed something. You just like put into a box something I've been thinking I haven't been able to like label until what you just said. Working in pre-IPO tech basically condenses life. Like all these things happen like so fast, right? You grow 57%, super quickly. And then like next thing you know, like half of your friends are leaving, like you're doing riffs. It turns out like these things do happen in life just on like a bigger scale. And so like you're not experiencing these highs and lows as often as you are in a pre-IPO tech company. And I think that's one of the reasons why I'm so personally addicted to it is because it's just like, I mean, it's kind of like Vegas. Like you sit at the blackjack table, you can win 5 hands in a row and you're feeling like I'm going to bankrupt this place. And then the next hand you get crushed. And there's just like nothing like that experience. I think you just like totally nailed exactly what happens inside of these companies and why it's exciting to work there and also why it's really challenging.
It is. I always say it's a drug to be addicted to, I guess gambling, all addiction. And the thing that I don't do enough, and I did it the other day, it was interesting. I just sat with a drink and reflected on this condensation of life. I just reflected on this, and I just think back like the last 16 years, and I can remember 16 years ago like it was yesterday, and yet all the experiences fly together like a flash of light, and all these people and your friends, and it's surreal. It really is. That's the best way I can explain it.
Yeah, it's wild times inside of tech companies. One of my best friends, Ashley Davis, we used to call it, cats live 9 lives. Well, tech employees live 9 lives in a day. And when you're actually at like inside of one of these companies, God, it's like something's on fire, something's going great, and it's just like it's this unbelievable rush that you can't really understand until you've actually lived it. And I think you just did a great job of describing that. All right, I have 2 more topics I want to hit on. One is your favorite interview question. So like, in my nosiness, I was diving through your background and came across a couple of videos around your favorite interview questions. One of which is, if I were to ask you like what is throwing you off your game, what would you tell me? And the other is, if I were your leader and I were to remove a barrier in your career, what would you want me to remove? Why are those two of your favorite questions?
Safety, psychological safety. The average
Say more.
So the average human, regardless of where you grew up or how phenomenal your parents were or how phenomenal your teachers were, I'm always going to index on the positive. We haven't really created environments where we can openly and safely say when things aren't going well, right? Like just the average human. Even if you do have that, you typically have that with someone that you've been forged through with time. Y'all have been through tough things together. It's like Kelly's my best friend, or like Nolan and I went to school together since seventh grade. Like you don't you don't typically just wake up one morning and be like, yeah, Kelly, let me just tell you what's throwing me off my game. And so my goal, the reason I say that is I remember having a young lady on my team, and I fired her. She was chronic with absenteeism. She had been warned. And like my parents are military and I'm the eldest of four. So like while I come across very people centric, like my grace level and my patience level at that point in my career was not nearly as high as it needed to be. She was on a final warning. She didn't show up. We fired her. I ended up going to arbitration and I ended up losing arbitration. Come to find out, her husband was deployed to Iraq. Her daughter had went out the night before and was drinking, and they couldn't find her. And so that's the reason she wasn't there. Now, was she still chronically late? Absolutely. But if I would have just taken the time to ask her, hey, like, you've been doing really, really good. You know you're on a final warning. Like, what's throwing you off your game? Like, why didn't you show up yesterday? You know I can fire you. Now, and so my goal was like, okay, how do I make sure that every human that may be thrown off, how do I make sure that they're safe? And I actually have another employee that I work with named Sarah. When I asked her the question the first time, she was like, hold on, what am I doing? Are you saying I'm off my game? I'm not off my game. And I'm like, no. Flag on the play. Which is what led me to the second question, which is if nothing's throwing you off your game, cool. If there was a barrier to your success that I could remove, what would it be? And you know what ends up happening when I ask that question? 99% of the time, somebody's going to name a barrier. Hey, I'm trying to get this new product done. You know, Kelly's our chief product officer, and she's saying that our tech stack is only going to be limited to 5. Or, hey, I'm trying to get this new guest on, but Nolan said that the agenda in the schedule for FY24 has already been set, and my guest wasn't on there. I think it could lead to a renewal of this customer. It never fails if I ask somebody what that barrier is, they're going to name something. Here's the unique thing though. Almost 40%, not quite 50, but probably 40% of the time, they name a barrier that's not professional.
That's so fascinating. I love that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. You know, Donald, I know you're older than me. I'm working on reverse caregiving. My mom just got cancer. Or, you know, me and my husband are expecting for the first time. What does that look like? Or, you know, my siblings are about to move overseas and they're afraid because they've never lived in this location before. Like it never fails. And so my goal is like, if you're in my leadership, like my goal is to make sure that safety is always there. And I don't want to put the responsibility on you to bring it up to me. Now I own the responsibility of creating that environment where you can say, yep, all is not well. Or, hey, can you help me out?
Part of the safety, right? And the next time they probably will bring it up to you.
Yeah, you're lowering the waterline with people, right? And I found that by asking really good questions, you can get to the truth really quickly. And I think what I'm learning in this one is that like your trick to this is your questions lower the waterline with folks. And it makes them feel safe in talking to you about those things. And the more information you know about that person, the better you can manage them, the better that you can help them, the better that you can get out of them. So those are really good. All right, I'm going to steal those. Those are excellent questions, Donald. Last question for me is, again, in my internet sleuthing, I came across that you're a CrossFitter. And, you know, one of the things I've been thinking about as I've just started investing more in my personal health over the last couple of years is that if I'm ever going to work for somebody again, I want them to be a model in all areas of life. And one of those areas of life I don't think we actually talk a lot about is physical health. I think physical health has a lot of translations into mental health and just general well-being. Tell me about that fitness journey for you. You're obviously like in great shape. Like, what do you do? Like, what break down for us and our audience, like how often you work out, how do you take care of yourself? What does that process look like?
Yeah, my parents are both military, both in the U.S. Army. My dad used to jump out of Black Hawk helicopters, and my mom was a medic. And so to PT in the morning is like normal course of behavior, almost like brushing your teeth. I also started to see things like in my family members, not my direct family members, but like cousins or aunts or uncles, things like diabetes or high blood pressure. And I didn't want that for me. But probably the biggest driver was, after becoming a dad, hearing people talk about like dad bods and like talking to my wife and like, I'm so serious. It's like we would go to like these business events and like the folks that typically had the most responsibility with the greatest title, and you couldn't see the commas behind their name on their W-2, but like you could guess, like their fitness just wasn't there. And so Nolan, to your point, I didn't choose people based off of their physical fitness, but I did choose to make certain life decisions for myself to make sure I'm sharp. And, with having children, like my afternoons don't belong to me. If I'm not doing something for business in the afternoon, then I'm doing something for my kids. If I'm not doing something for my kids, then I'm doing something for my community. So the afternoons are not mine. So most people know this about me. I have a pretty insane sleep regimen. I wake up every day at 3, Monday through Friday. I'm up at 3. I do meditation.
What?
Oh yeah, I do meditation.
3?
3 a.m. meditation and scripture, and sometimes yoga. Then I'm at the gym at 4 a.m. I chose my gym because it opens at 4 a.m. and I get after it. And I've had fellow executives get after with me. I've seen them change their journey as well. So shout out to my buddy Michael Booth, who's my former CTO at Greenhouse. Like we compared home gyms. That's one of the biggest bonding moments we had. And I can actually say on an offsite, he actually worked out with me and thought I was insane, but he stayed after it, and his fitness levels are back to where he was prior to having children. But yeah, man, like to your point, I just want to be my sharpest. That's what I'm on now. And I don't think I'm my sharpest if I'm only focused on my mental fitness or my business fitness. It's like, no, like all of that for me starts with health. So even my ring, man, I wear Ring Con. Some people wear Aura. I don't get a kickback from those companies, but I'm constantly trying to figure out how can I get another competitive edge. And it starts with fitness.
God, you just fired me up. 3 is insane though, Donald. Like that's fucking wild. Yeah. What is bedtime?
I mean, right now it's whenever Avery lets me sleep, right? She's 8 months tomorrow. So whenever she lets me, man, but typically, anywhere between 10 and 11, I don't really need a lot of sleep.
What?
Dude, so there's this, you think that's crazy. There's a gentleman named Ryan Leslie. I don't know him personally. One day I'm going to like nerd out with him. He started my crazy sleep habits in grad school. So he graduated from high school at 16 and he graduated at Harvard at 19. He used to do the Dymaxion sleep cycle, which basically is you take, I think like, I'm going to butcher this, but I think it was like 30-minute naps during the day and like a 3-hour sleep in the middle of the night. And he would wake up every morning and run 3 miles. And he's physically fit. Ended up going on to be one of the most critically acclaimed Grammy producers and songwriters. And I'm like, I looked at Ryan and I'm like, he's super smart, but like physically, I don't think he can like lift more than me or run faster than me. So I'm like, I got to dial my sleep in. And then when I had children, it went off from there. So yeah.
Wow. I'm so happy we hit this topic. I did not know that you woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning. Like, I follow Jocko Willnick, who's like notorious for like the 4 a.m., like the 4:24.
Yeah.
Taking a picture of his watch thing. I love that you take it to another level. And, Donald, thank you so much for an awesome conversation and personally like motivating me to be a better version of myself. I think our audience is going to learn a lot from this one.
Thanks, DK. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
HR Heretics is a podcast from Turpentine, the network behind Econ 102, Moment of Zen, and Turpentine VC. Subscribe, 5 stars, share it on Apple, YouTube, Spotify, anywhere you get your podcasts, all the things.